Gardner co-star in this one. Then Gregory Peck. Now, while many of the Hollywood's leading ladies were scrambling for roles, Ginger Rogers never had any trouble finding work or getting the star billing that she so well deserved. Black Widow was one of 2 pictures that she made back in 1954. The other was her only British film, Beautiful Stranger. That was with Herbert Loam. Her co-star, Van Heflin, was also busy making 4 pictures in 1954. But the lady who received 3rd billing was not quite as fortunate. Jean Tierney admitted in her autobiography that during the filming of Black Widow, she began to experience symptoms of the emotional breakdown she would suffer a few years later. The 50s were not a great time for George Raft, really, either, who saw a lot of his own money disappear when his TV series, I and the Law, failed before the end of the decade. And finally, there's Peggy Ann Garner, who at the age of 23 was appearing in her 18th feature film, and her last major role, by the way. Keep an eye out for the 26-year-old in the small part of Mr. Oliver. I'll tell you more about him later. Right now, here are Ginger Rogers, Van Heflin, and some of Hollywood's top names in Black Widow. Now, did you notice the actor who played the part of Mr. Oliver? We talked about that before the film. You may not have recognized his face, but I'm sure you have watched some of his television shows. That was Aaron Spelling, a young character actor from Dallas, Texas in those days. A few years after his small part in Black Widow, he became a producer for 4-Star Television. In 1969, he formed Aaron Spelling Productions, which produced things like Fantasy Island and Charlie's Angels, Heart to Heart, Love Boat, Hotel, and Dynasty, which was a fitting name for one of his shows because Aaron Spelling Productions created some of its own Hollywood dynasty. He and his wife are currently building a $60 million house, which is ostentatious even by Hollywood standards. He's also produced more than 100 feature films, most of them for television. Finally, I'd like to point out that the actress who played the cleaning woman in this movie was Kathleen Nisbet, a veteran character player of the British and American stage, making one of those rare film appearances. Now let's take a look.
You have 2. Everybody knows that Leroy Van Dyke's first big record was the
Studios just upside down before and during and after every take. The Marx Brothers ran crazy through the Paramount lot. Abbott and Costello once brought pies onto their set and threw them at unsuspecting crew members. And when Olsen and Johnson made Hell's a Poppin' at Universal, the back lot was never the same. When they were finished with the film, they returned to Broadway for a 2-year run in a show called Sons of Fun. Well, the 2 years were just enough for the studio to recover from the experience, and after their show closed, Olsen and Johnson were back in Hollywood once again. Universal signed them to make a movie on their lot that centered around the fact that Universal didn't want them to make another movie on their lot. Have you got that straight? Because all the scenes took place on the studio lot, it was an ideal opportunity to showcase all of the Universal talent. So almost every actor under contract at that time made some kind of a cameo appearance. So this movie is great fun. Having the plot revolve around activity on the lot was also a great excuse for musical and specialty numbers from some of the greatest names in the business to appear. Crazy House includes performances by Count Basie and his band, the Glenn Miller Singers and other bands, as well as cameos by Lon Chaney Jr., Andy Devine, Gail Sundergaard, Basil Rathbone, just about everybody around. Here's Crazy House. Olsen and Johnson, I think, are crazier than the Marx Brothers. Filming Crazy House on Crazy Street was crazy, as you would probably expect. Director Eddie Klein captured the madness with 2 camera units covering 80 pieces of business, as 165 players participated in non-stop gags all the way through this thing. You can imagine what the outtakes must have looked like. Just keeping track of the 156 props used in the film was a monumental task in itself. When asked about the 28 stars and 5 bands and 17 different acts that were showcased in this movie, Olsen and Johnson replied that it just goes to prove that vaudeville wasn't dead. And they had nothing to do with it. Now, here's today's movie question. In what comedy did Woody Allen say, after 15 years in analysis, I'm making excellent progress. Pretty soon, when I lie down on his couch, I won't have to wear the lobster bib. Allen and Marshall Brickman won an Oscar for their screenplay, by the way, in that one. I'll have the answer for you tomorrow.
Flattery, then MGM was extremely flattered by 20th Century Fox. In 1954, MGM released Executive Suite, which focused on the process of selecting a top executive for a furniture manufacturing company. A year later, 20th Century Fox made today's matinee classic, Woman's World, which also revolved around an executive search. but they all worked for a motor company. And if there was any doubt that the two movies were similar, Fox cast June Allison in Woman's World, virtually repeating her role in Executive Suite. Whenever a studio makes a movie that features many stars of equal stature, they always have trouble assigning billing order. Clifton Webb, who was still under contract to Fox, was given top billing, which is justified by the fact that his was the starring role. But the order for the other 6 presented a problem. Instead of straight alphabetical order, they alternated men and women. June Allison went first, then the first man in alphabetical order, who was Van Heflin, then the next woman, Lauren Bacall, then Fred McMurray, Arlene Dahl, and Cornell Wilde. Alphabetical order by sex. Simple. 3 couples are about to gather in New York City for a weekend that may change their lives. The men may be the ones applying for the jobs, but make no mistake about it, it's a woman's world. The year Woman's World came out, 2 of its stars also made their television debuts. Lauren Bacall's first TV appearance was on The Ed Sullivan Show, where there was a lot of joy in Mudville and everywhere else when she recited Casey at the Bat. Fred McMurray's TV debut was on The Jack Benny Show, where he played the saxophone in a sextet, which included Benny, Dick Powell, Dan Daly, Tony Martin, and Kirk Douglas. 1954 was a busy year for Fred McMurray. In addition to appearing with Jack Benny and making Woman's World, he also made a movie called Pushover at Columbia and became reacquainted with June Haver. They had met 9 years earlier on a picture called Where Do We Go From Here, but they hadn't kept in touch. A month after they met for the second time, they were married, and they've had one of the longest and happiest relationships in Hollywood. Be sure to join us next time when Debbie Reynolds will host the matinee.
You stole it from Mr.